Good evening and welcome to our conversation, Why Our Story Must Be Told, looking at the results of recent surveys on the public's knowledge of Japanese American incarceration during World War II. In an era where history, truth, and culture are actively being erased, understanding the importance and implication of the data from surveys such as these are a critical component of determining paths forward to stop this erasure. But before we begin, a little housekeeping. In order to keep the conversation moving, we ask that you put any questions you may have in the Q&A function at the bottom toolbar of your Zoom window. We will make every effort to present your questions to the panelists, but due to time constraints, we may not be able to get to all questions, nor present the questions in the order they were received. And we will try our best to combine similar questions so that the broad topics of concern or interest can be addressed. The chat function is not available during the webinar. However, our wonderful Zoom administrator, Sophia Alvarez, will provide messages and information in the chat box. We thank you for your patience and your understanding, as we know this is going to be a very dynamic conversation. My name is Jim Hurt, and I'm the director of the Daniel K. Inouye National Center for the Preservation of Democracy here at the Japanese American National Museum. We are thrilled to be working with the Japanese American Citizens League on the release of this data and are so grateful for the panelists who will be joining us and bringing their wealth of knowledge to this discussion. With that, I'm pleased to turn over the discussion to my colleague from JACL, Matthew Wisely. Matthew?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jim. And hello, everyone. Good to be here. My name is Matthew Wisely. As Jim said, I'm the Education Programs Manager for the Japanese American Citizens League National, and I'm based out here in Los Angeles. But first, just a big thank you to Jim and Sophia and the JANM team for helping us put this event on. We're very excited to be here and very excited to present this data and talk about this data with all of you. So I'll be the moderator for tonight's discussion, but before we get into our discussion, we first want to go over the data itself. So we are very happy and honored to be joined by a wonderful presenter who will be presenting our data for us tonight, Karthik Ramakrishnan, who I'll give a brief bio of. So Karthik is a researcher at UC Berkeley and the director of the university's AAPI Data Project, a nationally recognized publisher of AAPI demographic data and policy research. Also a strategy lead for the Americas at School of International Futures, which transforms futures for future generations. And he's also a senior advisor at States for the Future, a collaboration of organizations and states solving the significant systemic challenges that states and the nation face now and into the future. Welcome, Karthik, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Matthew, and thank you, everyone, for this important conversation, not only in terms of what's happening today, but with respect to the historical understanding of what has happened to our communities, and in particular, the Japanese American community, and how it can inform the important work ahead. I'll ask for a share of screen so that I can go over the findings. So I'll say that I was thrilled to be asked to present on these findings that is built on Amplify AAPI. So Amplify AAPI is a nationally representative panel of Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders with in-language support for the main languages where Asian Americans need to have that assistance. So that's in Mandarin and Cantonese, Korean, and Vietnamese. Amplify API enables us as researchers, as people who care about community, people who want to understand community, to be able to conduct survey research in a relative cost-effective manner that meets the high standards of social science research. I'm on the board of Amplify API, and I'm thrilled to be asked to help present and make sense of the findings later on when we have Q&A. Let's go to the next slide, please. So in terms of the methodology, so this survey was collected in January, and this is important to note that this is not just something based on the heat of the moment. So even prior to President Trump's inauguration, this was in January of this year. This reflects the mood of the API community. More recently, you've had a comparison sample of the general population. So we can talk about whether we think the findings for APIs may be even more amplified now than what we saw in January. But that's it's important to know when the data were collected. You had over 1,000 Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander adults that were part of this study, and the margin of error is plus or minus 5% or so. Next slide. So I had mentioned that we had this original, well, the team had this original set of questions that was asked of API adults, and a subset of their questions were also asked of the general population. And part of what I'll do in my remarks is also make reference to some of the findings that API data found both last year and this year that are consistent with the findings, which should add confidence in the robustness of the results here. Next slide. So first, in terms of awareness, um, I almost wish that we didn't have a chance to look at the data, but depending on what your expectations are, it may be surprising to people that only 73% of ANHPIs are aware of the World War II executive order that led to the roundup and incarceration of Japanese Americans. But remember that Asian Americans are still a predominantly first generation immigrant population. So, in terms of where they get their education, most people, including those who are college educated, most Asian Americans who are college educated got educated in Asia, not in the United States. So even though it might be surprising to people to see that it's only 73% for APIs, that should hopefully help provide some context. By contrast, the general population is much more likely to have been born in the US, gone to school in the US, and there you see only 2/3 have that awareness. So this shows that there's a lot of work to be done in terms of refreshing people's memories, if you will, or to telling new populations who have not had that exposure about the story of the Japanese internment, including the particular actions taken by the federal government, including the Executive Order 9066. Next slide. Next is how familiar are you with the World War II executive order that led the US government to round up and incarcerate? How familiar? So the first slide was about awareness. Second is about familiar. And similar patterns that we see for the GenPop and APIs, except for APIs, they're less likely to say not at all familiar, and they're slightly more likely to say very familiar. But remember that this is within the poll's margin of error. If you subtracted 5 points from very familiar and added a couple of points to the GenPop sample, so pretty much a similar distribution. Next slide. So again, thinking about this in terms of not only are they aware or are they familiar, but what is the factual information that they're holding in their heads, right? And what we see is that the general population is slightly more likely to say that they're unsure as to whether most of the individuals who were incarcerated were citizens of the US or citizens of Japan. And you find that AAPIs are about as likely as the general population to make the error. But again, remember, most of these folks did not get educated in the US. They got most of their education in Asia. So less than 2/3, so about 60% of APIs give the correct answer, which is most of the people were citizens of the US and not citizens of Japan. This is really important later on when we talk about what would that awareness mean if we raise that level of awareness in terms of how people might think of the current situation and the steps we might need to take to prevent such an occurrence in the future. Next slide. Next, do you believe incarceration was right or wrong? And here you see the most dramatic difference between APIs and the general population. The general population is more likely to say that they're unsure. So 1/3 of the American public is unsure whether incarceration was right or wrong. But note that even among APIs, 21% say that they're unsure. A lot of it is likely due to that gap in awareness, right? In terms of not being aware, not being familiar with the details. of what occurred and who was being incarcerated. Especially if you think that a bunch of people think it might be citizens of Japan. Part of that, even though the survey did not ask the reasons why, it's possible that they think that these are people with dual loyalties or stronger loyalties to Japan than to the United States. Next slide. Do you think the subject of the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II should be included in high school history classes in the US? And a very high proportion say yes. Now, one thing I would say as a survey researcher, we should be a little bit careful about priming effects because they've just been asked a series of questions specifically about internment. So there are different factors, including social desirability, that might prompt the person to say yes. But the data are the data, so at least it shows that a high proportion of both APIs as well as the general population, when they're introduced these questions about the internment, say that yes, this should be taught in high school history classes in the US. Next slide. Next, it connects this with hate. So with the anti-Asian hate during the pandemic and anti-Asian rhetoric stemming from increasing tensions between the US and China, are you fearful that incarceration of Asian Americans could happen in the future? And here we see a population, this is for the AANHPI population only, that is split, right? You see about a third, yes, about a third, no, and a little over a quarter that are unsure. So, and it's difficult to know what is the right answer here, but this does give us a sense of the uncertainty in our population. Some people may think one-third saying yes is extremely high. Some people may say that it's not high enough because the risk is quite high and more people should take that risk seriously. And that's something for Q&A, but also community conversation in the coming months in terms of how should we look upon history and the lessons of those history for what might happen today and what we need to do today. Next slide. How likely do you think that incarceration of Asian Americans could happen in the future? Again, this is only of ANHPI populations. You have a majority saying not very likely, right? Or not at all likely. If you combine those together, it's above 50%. But troublingly, more than a third say that it's somewhat likely, and little less than 1 in 10 say that it's very likely. So certainly this is seen among API adults in this country as a risk worth monitoring. Next slide. Next, how important is it to teach students about the challenges and contributions of Asian Americans in shaping US society? And you see that 61% say that it's very important. 32% of APIs say that it's somewhat important. So when you combine that together, you have over 90% saying that it's somewhat important or very important for this to be taught, the contributions and challenges of Asian Americans to be taught in schools. For the general population, it's a little bit lower in terms of those who say that it's very important. I'll note that when we ask this question, quite apart from this context. So what gives me confidence in these findings is if someone were just asked a series of questions about internment and then asked this, you might say, okay, you're kind of putting your thumb on the scales. But what's interesting is that we have a very high proportion, not as high as, say, over 90%, but over 3/4 of APIs when we ask them about the teaching of API history in K through 12 schools, they are supportive of that policy. By the way, they're also supportive, almost identically, uh, to support the teaching of the history of racism and slavery in America in K through 12 schools. So that's important context where our communities are interested not only because of the struggles that our communities have faced, but also the struggles of other communities of color, including Black Americans. Next slide. And then finally, do you think the inclusion of Asian American events in history education could help address stereotypes or biases? And you see 3/4 of APIs saying yes, it would. I would caution as a survey researcher, again, you have these priming effects. We don't have the comparison, in a survey that didn't ask these prior questions. But I would venture to guess that it might not be as high as 76%, but it would still be well over a majority saying that that this would help address stereotypes or biases. In the general population, it is a smaller proportion, but still a majority that say so. So those are the findings of the study, and I will kick it back to Matthew, I believe, who will help lead discussion and Q&A. And I don't know if this is when we have Professor Umamoto joining us as well.
And thank you, Karthik. And yes, we will get started with Q&A and discussion here. And with that, I will actually introduce Dr. Karen Umamoto. Dr. Umamoto is the Helen and Morgan Chu Endowed Chair and Director of the UCLA Asian American Studies Center, also a Professor of Asian American Studies and Urban Planning at UCLA. Her research centers on issues of democracy and race relations in multicultural societies, focusing on youth and community building. And she's the co-editor of Foundations and Futures, a free online multimedia textbook about AAPI histories and experiences that will be released in the summer or fall of this year. So we are very excited to see that. I've gotten a chance to see it myself, and it looks fascinating. So very honored to have Dr. Imamoto join us for this discussion.
Thank you for having me, Matthew, and thanks, Karthik, for that good, strong presentation and highlighting a lot of the important findings from the NORC survey.
So actually, in kicking off our discussion, since we just heard Karthik go through the data and discuss a little bit about his thoughts, actually wanted to ask you, Dr. Imamoto, what your initial thoughts are of the data. Well, you've seen it before, but just after the presentation, what your initial thoughts would be.
Yeah, I mean, it's filled with kind of good news and bad news. And some in between. I think that looking at the survey and comparing it also to the TAF's status index survey, people tend to know more about the internment of Japanese Americans than any other part of Asian American and Pacific Islander history. Yet the fact that 33% of non-Asians are unsure whether or not it was right or wrong is one of the most alarming things to me. And that the fact that so many Asian Americans, 37% feel that it can happen again, is one thing that, especially during this moment in history, is very troubling. So I think there are lots of lessons and implications of these findings that prompt us to develop a stronger sense of urgency to do something about this, because it's one thing for people to know about it, but it's another thing for people to feel that, yeah, maybe it was okay, or maybe it was justified.
Yeah, and Karthik, feel free to hop in if there's anything that, if either of you say anything that the other wants to tag team or talk about, please feel free to hop in.
Yeah, I mean, I think that again, what I said earlier, it's hard to know kind of what our baseline expectation should be. And I kind of surprised, like, I don't know, I think we're all surprised in terms of the tolerance for things in American society today that would not have been tolerated a decade ago. But I do want to provide some context, and I'll just say I'm just so appreciative of JACL and the Japanese American community for being a consistent voice, not only for Japanese Americans or for Asian Americans, but for other communities that have been targets of the federal government in the past. So I still remember after 9/11 when you had NSEERS, which is the National Security Entry Exit Registration System, right? That was the Muslim registry well before there was a Muslim ban. And it's one thing to have South Asian groups stand up and say that this is not right, but it was so powerful and important for JACL to say that this is not right. And that's something that I hope, and I've seen that consistently in the Japanese American community. And I think it is that searing experience of the internment that makes it so. But part of my hope when you think about the diversity in our community is also to understand that, yes, most people are first generation immigrants. It might not automatically come to them like, oh, with anti-China rhetoric, it really doesn't matter what the country is that you're talking about. Really, it's about a certain exclusionary vision of America That's something would be my hope, quite apart from the general population within the API community, that we have a stronger sense of how our fates are tied together, and to follow the example of JACL and others to speak up even when it's not your particular group that's being targeted.
Can I piggyback on that a little bit? Just because it's great to be in conversation with you, Karthik. It's, I think you're absolutely right. And I think what bothers me the most about so many people being unsure whether or not the incarceration experience was right or wrong is that, one, it tells us that we need to do a lot better education about the camps. It's one thing, yeah, for people to know about it, but I think a deeper understanding of the camp experience is so important. I think there are so many ways that education can play an important role, and I do really appreciate the role of JANM in being really the champions, along with, Densho and other organizations, but really in terms of exhibitry and, physical presence and the curriculum development and educational work that JANM does, and along with JCL and others, is really vital. And I think we have to be more deliberate about what are some of the things we want to highlight about that camp experience. So, for example, I think building off of what Karthik was saying about the implications uh, or the connections to what's happening today. I think a lot of people don't really understand the ways in which the Enemy Aliens Act has been invoked, and that Japanese American, the executive order and the internment was was the most recent, right, invocation of the Enemy Aliens Act. Also, I think a lot of young people today don't really understand what the 14th Amendment is in terms of their constitutional rights, as being born in the US, having rights to certain protections and rights that are being violated, that were violated then, and are in many cases are being violated now. I think also there's a need for the kind of education that really brings out the humanity of the situation, so people can develop that kind of historical empathy for others. In this case, curriculum and education on Japanese Americans develops that kind of empathy towards what Japanese Americans experienced in that time, and through that opens up a lot of lines for healthier communication, open communication, people being able to stand in each other's shoes, and then to be able to judge whether something's right or wrong, right, by taking the positionality of another group. So I think those are just a few of the many things that could come out of the educational work that we do, especially us too, as the Asian American Studies Center, in a more deliberative way that links it to what's happening now.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Uemoto. And yeah, I did not, yeah, I was gonna say, I was talking a lot about JACL. I still remember going to a couple of the exhibits at JANM, including some of the special exhibits that come from time to time when I lived in Southern California, and just remembering how powerful it's one thing to read about something or even see something on a small screen or a bigger screen, but to be there, right, and kind of have that more immersive experience is so powerful. And yeah, I think with examples like that, but also with the textbook that the UCLA team is working on, hopefully can even as states pass these laws and you get teachers that are starting to get trained on this, that these resources can be helpful for the next generation of Americans, including Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders.
If I don't know, Matthew, did you want to ask questions, or should we just keep going on talking?
I mean, I have talking points in case we need it, but I like where the conversation is going. But
Okay.
I did actually have a question, and it sort of ties into what you've been discussing around the education piece. So looking back, especially at questions 9 and 10, that talk about how people feel about the importance of teaching this Asian American history in school and how it might combat racism and biases. given that it's so high, I mean, both were what I think over 90% in question 9 and pretty close in question 10. Given that so many people are supportive of that teaching, why do you think, or do you have any feelings about why people will say that, but it's not reflected in the actual classroom or in the education setting? Which I know is a big loaded question, but we just wanted to start there.
You want me to go first, or do you
Yeah,
want to go
kind
first?
of. I mean, especially I would love to hear, as you're scoping out and then deploying this textbook, I'm sure your team has done a fair amount of research of what are some of the barriers or friction points that you would encounter, right, to get adoption.
Yeah. Um, I think part of it is political. We don't have as much of a political voice as, say, Jews, the Jewish community, in being able to make sure that the stories of the Holocaust are in every textbook, every history textbook. So I think there our political presence in the education space and just in general is not as strong. So I think the work that people are doing in Congress now, I think um, um, Mazie Hirono and Grace Meng are putting forth legislation right now in Congress to push Asian American history in K through 12 education. So I think that's part of it. I think the other part is just the availability of popular facing materials on Asian Americans. So ethnic studies, we're 55 years old now, and there's just been such a plethora of resources and knowledge uncovered and books published and journal articles galore, but a lot of that hasn't been translated into the kinds of prose and formats that are more easily accessible for K through 12 students or college students. And then I think there's a certain amount of just, if Asian Americans we're 7% of the population, but we're only 2% of the teacher population. So if we're only 2% of the nation's teacher population, and if it's mainly Asian Americans, who might take, or if Asian Americans are the ones who may be more inclined to go out of their way to integrate it into their curriculum, then we have a long way to go, and we really need the support of the education community more broadly in helping to ensure that our histories and other histories are included in education. So I want to make a shout out to a couple people, Al Maritsuchi, Mike Fong, and Phil Ting, for championing our work that led to a legislative allocation of $10 million to the Asian American Studies Center at UCLA to create this free online multimedia textbook. And we've really done our best. We're creating 50 chapters, and one of them is on the Japanese American incarceration chapter, authored by Stan Yogi. And with curriculum written by the Yuri Education Project. So this is one of several on Japanese Americans specifically, and another one on Japanese Americans history writ large is co-authored by JANM and Densho. So we really appreciate the collaboration with community organizations, community scholars, and archives and history keepers to be able to bring a lot of this history right to the American public. So hopefully, please contact the Asian American Studies Center at UCLA if you're interested. We really want this resource to be used in all classrooms across the country. So.
Yeah, I'll just add, first of all, it's just amazing to see the Q&A with not only friends and colleagues, but folks in pretty powerful positions joining this webinar, including Rep. Tomiko Santos from the great state of Washington, who is expert in education, among other things. And she asks I think a really good and important question, Karen, that
Yeah.
connects to what you'd said is how do we make sure that those who are then tasked with teaching it. So it's one thing for people who are self-interested and they can raise their hand and say it. But if it's a mandate, then teacher training becomes so important. So I think at least my take on it would be quite apart from resourcing it, it's how does this get implemented if you have legislation that gets passed at a state level so that there are multiple opportunities and multiple ways for teachers to learn. One thing I'll just put for later, but I'll plant the seed, is to think about what education and awareness raising looks like outside of the classroom as well. Especially, right, if you think of most APIs, they're here, they've already, if they've gone to college, they've already gone to college, and usually in Asia and not here. How can we then use some of these materials and repackage them in other ways to have community conversations? And then for people for whom like their small screens is how they get most of their information, right? How do we make sure that this enters that bloodstream, if you will, of information that might even have some element of, I hate to say it, entertainment, but some way for it to be engaging so that it's not just seen as like a heavy topic. That's something. Final thing I'll say, and this is something I've been thinking about a lot as someone who not only runs API data, but who's been a scholar of immigration policy for a couple of decades now. I think what we're seeing today are echoes of internment in different guises. Like what's happening in El Salvador. It's not the same as rounding people up and putting them in a rural, remote location in the US. But functionally, I mean, it's even worse, right? So there's almost, even when there is an attempt to get a constitutional recourse, to get where the Supreme Court says you need to do this, the US can kind of export that work and say, oh, it is out of the hands of the US government now, right? So to create this kind of legal black hole. And so that's something I think that we need to start thinking about, where it's not, if something like incarceration happens again, it might not take the same form. In fact, it already is not taking the same form. It's taking a different form and it is already happening. Maybe not to the same large scale as it was before. So I think having some of that, making history alive to current circumstances and showing the connections, even, there's that expression, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And we're seeing what that rhyming looks like right now. And I think that'll be an important part of public education, not just within the classroom, but truly, in terms of how we engage and inform the public.
And I think that speaks well to Representative Sharon Tomiko Santos's comment about and question about the importance of providing teacher education to be able to equip teachers to teach it in a way that reaches some of the goals that Karthik you just mentioned, because in California there was the Ethnic Studies AB 101 passed that mandates ethnic studies as a graduation requirement for all high school students, and it on a 4-year cycle it really begins this fall. But a couple years ago, we kind of assessed that we were about 400 to 500 teachers short of being able to meet that mandate because people were not trained in ethnic studies. And I think that one of the hallmarks, there are kind of 5 hallmarks of an ethnic studies pedagogy. So one is just having that knowledge, right? The content knowledge. But the second is to be able to see the world from different positionalities through whether ancestral knowledge or indigenous knowledge or, through other people's shoes. And the third is to understand kind of the structures of power that shape society and the environment, so that people know how to, what the levers of change are. And then to be able to understand each other, to build the kind of self-respect, but also mutual respect and communication across cultures and across difference. And then lastly, to engender that sense of agency so that people can understand how history was made, but also see themselves as history makers as well. So I think those kind of 5 pillars of pedagogy that grew out of the legacy of ethnic studies is really important in terms of preparing teachers so that it's doesn't we don't have a backlash right against ethnic studies, because it really is about holistic well-being and compassion and historical empathy. You know, Karthik, do you want to, there are certain things that, certain questions that deal with the kind of political pushback?
Yeah, so I'm happy to talk. So I'll just read on some of this. And yeah, I don't know, Matthew, if you want to read some of them, but happy to. So there's a really good, important question from an attendee that says, considering the prevalence of anti-DEI sentiment in politics, what is the likelihood that additional information about the Japanese American internment will actually be included in various curricula? This is a really good and important question. I think sometimes politics might surprise, and still don't quite know what to make of it, including, say, for example, the state of Florida passing a law that gives more exposure to the history of Asian Americans in curricula at the same time that they passed a host of measures, that went in the other direction on DEI and other matters that are important to our communities. So that's something on the one hand, you can say it's like, take the wins when you got them, even if there are things that are, going against our community's interests in other ways. But my recommendation is to be smart about it. And I think some of the questions we're getting about how is this actually going to get implemented? Is it going to be resourced properly? I would hope that the UCLA textbook project, gains adoption well beyond the state of California. Right? But that's not guaranteed. Each state is very protective in terms of its own educational standards. So, but I would hope that at least states that maybe don't have that same reaction could, if not wholesale adopt, at least adapt aspects of the curricular development in California to go elsewhere. But I think the one of the things I would say more generally, that the way I've been thinking about it, one of the problems with DEI, whenever you make something an acronym, and it's easy to have all sorts of misconceptions about what exactly it is. Fundamentally, this is an accurate reading of American history, period. You cannot talk about American history without understanding this moment and this development, how it came to be, what the consequences, what happened, what was that experience like, and what are the consequences, right? Including ways that communities got empowered and learned. It took some time, right? But even that process of redress and what that looked like, that's American history. So my hope is that regardless of whatever label you use, that Americans of all stripes, political, racial, ethnic, etc., understand that this is fundamentally American history, and we need to have an accurate understanding of American history. And that includes those who want to tell positive stories of America. Like, there are plenty of positive stories even in this experience, but we need to understand the full complexity and the totality of the experience, right? Instead of trying to ignore it, to say that's a shameful period in our history, and therefore we're not going to spend any time, or that's an exceptional period, and therefore we're not going to look at it. So that would be my hope, that there is still room to advance this work, even if the boogeyman or the stereotype, the vast caricature of what DEI is, prevents other good things from happening.
I see a question from Roland Huang. Maybe we could address some of these questions that are coming in. How can we tie the denial of equal protection and due process legal principles be incorporated into the teaching of historical facts about World War II incarceration and how it ties to the issue of World War II with the present day. I think one of the biggest constitutional issues here had to do with the 14th Amendment, so that those born in the U.S. are naturalized U.S. citizens and have the right to life, liberty, and property with equal protection of the laws. And this amendment is especially significant in showing how Japanese Americans' constitutional rights were violated. And I think there are so many cases these days where people are denied due process. And I think some of those cases pursued by the current administration have been overturned in the courts. And I think that's a good thing. But I think there's more that can be learned about whether it's the Enemy Aliens Act, whether or not it's some of the details of the Fred Korematsu case, the Yasui case, and other cases that were that reached, the Supreme Court and higher courts in the country, and to be able to, have students actually study those and understand why they were successful, or why they were why it took so long to overturn some of the decisions that should not have been made in the first place. So we I think are in danger of accepting some of the court decisions that are taking place now. And I think, 20, 30 years from now, we may look back on it like we look back on the Fred Korematsu's case or Min Yasui's cases, and see the cases, for the American public to evaluate the cases in a much different light. But I think because of what we're learning about Japanese American incarceration, that we should have more foresight to be able to make the assessment, a more critical assessment of some of the decisions that are taking place today.
So I see, I'll read another question from Buckji, who asks regarding building political power, including, say, what Jewish Americans have been able to achieve, and perhaps others. Would JACL join a national effort working to pull together a bipartisan Pan-Asian API coalition to build a higher profile API public voice? I'll note that Buck is a friend and a colleague. Buck, thank you for that question. I will not speak for JACL, and I don't even know if JACL can speak for that now. But I'll just say, as someone who not only collects data, but uses data to help inform strategy, I think what you touch upon there is both the need for something like that, but potentially also the challenges, right? And this is something, for as long as I've been doing this work, so even before I went to grad school, people in our communities, and not just APIs in general, like specifically in like particular South Asian communities, people look to the Jewish American model as something to aspire to. It's like, wow, look at that group. They're relatively small, but they're mighty, and they're able to make sure to unify and advocate for their interests. And one of the kind of central organizing principles is the state of Israel, and a kind of homeland for Jewish people in the aftermath of World War II, right? And so that's, no matter what differences people might have based on their region in the US, their political ideology and stripe, that ends up becoming a rallying cry. It's hard to figure out what that rallying cry is that is unique to our communities, that would not also, say, apply to Black communities or Latino communities that are feeling under attack. But that can be seen as an asset. You know what? Like, there's some expression, right? Like, even if, no matter how we came in, we're all in the same boat, right? We might have come in by plane or ship or whatever else. But that sense of common circumstance and common cause, I think, could be a unifying factor. But I think, Buck, part of what you point out, there needs to be a level of entrepreneurialism, funding, and I'll just say, like, my observation in our community is that there are a lot of people with a lot of good ideas, um, but not enough people saying, "Hey, let's try to come together." Because it's tougher that I find in the nonprofit sector and in the social impact sector, for people to put aside, whatever their obligations and responsibilities may be to fundraise for their nonprofit, to say, what can we do together that would, be a collective good. But I do think we have to solve that collective action problem, because if we don't, it's relatively easy to play communities off of each other, or to play on apathy, or the inability for people to organize when the circumstances call for them.
Maybe I could add just some practical resources. I just want to turn people's attention to the Densho site. There's a site, if you Google 10 documentaries about Japanese American incarceration, you can watch online for free now. You will see, you'll have links to those. My favorite camp film is Family Gathering by Lisa Yasui. I think it's just really moving, and it's been great to use in classes here at UCLA on Japanese American incarceration. In terms of organizations or projects working on teacher training for ethnic studies, UCLA's teacher education program just started last year, a 4-course ethnic studies teacher certificate program, and I encourage people to check that out. UC Santa Barbara has the Espito program. UC Irvine has the Teacher Academy. There's nonprofits as well, like Yuri Education Project, JANM and Densho, who offer teacher training, especially in the summer. And then there are unions like the National Education Association, the American Federation of Teachers, that often offer teacher training. And we're trying to work with the National Education Association to develop a micro-credential program in Asian American Studies using the textbook. So hopefully we'll get the textbook out. If you write to our center, I don't have the center address right now, but you could get on our mailing list so that you could find out when the chapters are ready for use. We'll have 6 chapters ready for teacher use in the summer, and then hopefully in the fall, a dozen or 2 more. So we're very excited about the launch of the textbook. It's free, open access. And we have 90 scholars across the country who have written 50 chapters with thousands of multimedia, videos, films, video clips, audio clips, book excerpts, and photos and primary source documents. So we try to make it as engaging and educational as possible.
If I could maybe just hop in, this is David Inoue with JCL. Wanted to sort of talk a little bit more about the idea of coalition work and how do we as an Asian American community come together. I think it's sort of grounded in that history that we're focusing on Japanese American history tonight around the incarceration experience, but the racism that led to the incarceration was the same racism that was part of the Chinese Exclusion Acts of the late 1800s. It is the same racism that drove a lot of those immigration laws that led to the Wong Kim Ark case, which affirmed birthright citizenship. And then it's that same racism that over 40 years ago, Vincent Chin was murdered because of being mistaken as Japanese as a Chinese American. And I think we're seeing that kind of flipped on its head now today when we see a Japanese American who is assaulted because he's perceived to be Chinese. But I think pointing to, like, I think the Vincent Chin experience in particular, that is one of those things that really did sort of bring us to that idea of an Asian American identity, and that really we do need to be recognizing that even though we may have our differences based on our ethnic heritage, that this country does see us as an Asian American people. That said, was it 19 years ago, actually, in 1996, JCL, joining with OCA and some other organizations, actually created a coalition, the National Council on Asian Pacific Americans, which now has, I believe, over 40 members across the country. And one of the products that we just put out is a 100-day report on the first 100 days of the new administration, which I'd really encourage everyone to go out and look at. If I remember correctly, the website is ncapaonline.org/100-day report. I'm kind of going off memory right now, but if you go to the NCAPA website, NCAPA, online.org, it's right there on the front page. I'd really urge folks to look at that, because it really does not only looks at what has been happening over the last first 100 days of the administration, but also does put it in some of that historical context as well, particularly in the context of Japanese Americans and the Alien Enemies Act. We just celebrated the 50 years since the fall of the Saigon and Southeast Asian immigration. And I think it is, as we are talking about history tonight, it is important to understand that so much of our history is tied together as an Asian American community, also as an immigrant community.
Yeah, I'll just quickly jump in, as I know that we're running close to the end of time. Folks, we know we have a fair amount of survey data, and in addition to this great work that JCL and JANM have put together here today. Survey released just last week speaks to the importance, the continued importance and trust that API communities place in our educational system, and the high levels of concern they have about various ways that intellectual freedom is being compromised, free speech is being suppressed, students are being having their visas revoked and being deported, research and funding cuts to universities. And I think going beyond just this particular case of our lessons being taught, our communities know that an educated population is one that is more likely to defend individual rights and liberties, less likely to see what divides us, and more likely to see what unites us. So my call to action would be for our community to, I don't think our community's woken up now in terms of what's happening, but we got to do something about it. Another data point that was really worrying for a lot of us is that API adults don't think their children will be better off than they are. We don't have the same data from before, but I would venture to guess that that's probably the first time in the last 50 years that is true. And that is a warning sign. So I think that we really owe it to all of us to bring our most creative talents to bear, to make sure that we not only defend education in K through 12 and higher education, that we defend the truth, because that is one of the most fundamental assets that we have, regardless of who we are, is to have that steadfast commitment to the truth and to make sure that everyone knows the truth.
Agreed. And actually, Karthik, you beat me to my last question, which was going to be what your call to action might be. So if you have another one, feel free to share. But also, Dr. Mimoto, if you have any last calls to action or anything that folks can take away from this and do with this information.
Yeah, I think there are so many things happening right now. Attacks on DEI is one of them, one of many. And I think there's the attacks on DEI and CRT, and the weaponization even of anti-Semitism has been putting such a hush over our feelings of being free to express ourselves, to express our political views, to share our histories. And so my call to action is for all of us to be bold, right? To not stand down, and to be forthright in the kind of work that we're doing, to educate people about our histories, the good, bad, ugly, and joyous and sad, and not feel any shame or fear. Because I think once we start feeling fearful, right, then we're kind of self-censoring. So we all have to stick together.
I'll just quickly add to my call to action, Matthew, is that so what we have seen in observations, talking to leaders in Congress, they're saying, well, we need the people to rise up. And people are like, we need you, members of Congress, to step up and speak up. So I think one way out of that catch-22 situation is contact your members of Congress. Tell them that they need to step up and they need to speak up, because we know that that makes a difference. They also need to be innovative, right? So just the standard C-SPAN shot when you're making a speech, like, is not going to cut it. And so we all need to understand that we are competing for people's attention, and especially as they're going through economic struggles, and we need to get creative. But the more your members of Congress, including members that are friendly to our community's interest, hear from us, the more likely they are to prioritize us. If mostly what they see when they look out into their constituent landscape is silence, that's not really encouraging to them to take any risk. So we need to start stepping up and contacting our elected representatives, including those in our district, but also those who can and should be our champions in Washington, D.C.
Harry and Karthik, thank you so much for those closing thoughts. And before we close out, I'll actually hand it back over to our Executive Director, David Inouye, to give out some closing remarks.
Not much I can really say after those exhortations from both Karthik and Karen. But just want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. It's been this evening has gone much too quickly, I think. I think there's a lot more that we could discuss around this. But I think that's part of what this is. It's to open up this dialogue, to remind us all about how important history is and how important the truth is. And I think that is where JCL and JANM are so happy to be working together on this, because and just as JANM as a museum is so important in presenting the truth, when JCL does its advocacy work, it is also very important that our advocacy is also based in the truth and what is right. So all of us working together, hopefully all of you will go forward and also remind others about how this story is important, how all of our histories are important, that this is part of an American history, not just a Japanese American history, not just Chinese American or Indian American, but a truly American history. So thank you all for joining us tonight, and have a good evening.